Dominic Whitehead, so glad to have you with us, head of NAACP growth and mobilization in the past, and just a operative who has extensive experience and I think is doing the work at a time where it's probably an uphill battle, but I'm sure you'll tell us about that. So excited to have you with us. Tell folks a little bit about yourself.
Thanks for having me, Kevin. Excited to have this discussion with you today. But as you said, Dominic Whitehead, our chief of field here at the NAACP. I have the responsibility of managing our civic engagement, our advocacy, our membership growth, and youth and college work across the association. So managing the field. But prior to that, I was our senior vice president of campaigns and civic engagement, where I've led a lot of our civic engagement efforts from 2020 actually 2018 through about 2024, where we have touched well over 25 million Black voters across the country and invested millions of dollars in states on the ground, to our units on the ground, as well as partner organizations to do all things voter mobilization.
Wonderful. And I guess just right out of the gate, under this current administration, it feels like Black Americans are under attack. And especially we can talk about the jobs numbers of Black women. And I'm curious, how has your work changed or not changed maybe over the last several years as administrations come and go? And obviously, you've done a lot of local organizing work. So I'm really curious how that infrastructure evolves as well.
Yeah, it's always ever evolving. The one thing I'd like to say, the NAACP is 116 years old. We'll be 117 years old in February. And so we are no stranger to ever evolving changes as it relates to democracy. We have always been on the front line protecting, preserving, and advancing democracy, not only for Black folks, but people in this country. But we think about this current administration, we are seeing things that we've never seen before, or things that we just have not seen in a very, very, very long time. Right? It's not just a threat of democracy, it is the constant attacks, the blatant attacks that are continuing to happen. As you mentioned a second ago, we're seeing the numbers of the job market when it comes to African American, particularly Black women, well over 300,000 plus and still growing. Black women has lost jobs since this administration has been in place. We're seeing attacks at the local and state level, where we're clearly seeing attacks in cities with Black mayors, right? Whether it's LA, Chicago, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., the list goes on, Memphis, with National Guard troops and police being militarized on the ground and really targeting communities of color, whether they be Black folks, Black immigrants, the brown community as well. And so when we think about the work of the NAACP, for us, we knew this coming in, right? Because we've seen this before in 2016 when this current administration, this current president, took in office in 2016, 2017. And so we did everything we could to prepare our units and our members, our front line, our chapter, excuse me, our branches across the country to be on the front line and be ready to go to prepare for these attacks. And so for us at the association, the only thing changed for us is how do we be more proactive instead of reactive. So we want to be in a proactive stance. The other thing is that we're going to continue to mobilize, educate our base and the larger general public on what's happening.
And how is the work on educating the base? One of the things I've been talking about more recently is I feel like the left has finally tried to figure out new media and social media and all of these things that obviously after 2024 feels like some folks woke up and said, oh, well, the right has all this stuff down and they've been doing it for a decade and they've been investing in all these things and people as well. And yet, when I look at some of the bigger left media, to me, it's recreated a lot of the lack of diversity issues that originally we were bringing up in the early 2000s and really last decade of legacy media. And so, how do you think about that in terms of reaching folks and organizing folks? And what does the ecosystem look like in new media to reach minority voters, specifically Black voters?
I think that's a really good question because narrative control and messaging is just so important, as well as who is the messenger,
Mhm.
and then who that messenger is messaging to, that audience, that universe. And so I have seen a shift since the last presidential election cycle from progressives and Democrats. Clearly, NAACP is nonpartisan, but I have seen a shift from progressives and Democrats and trying to reach different audiences, whether it be the Black community, whether it be younger voters or younger folks, to understand what is happening, but then also carrying that message. I think you're right, right? When we think about traditional or legacy media, it has evolved in so many different ways. And so people don't always trust media all the time. But then the other piece is, right, folks are on their devices all day. We're on
Yeah.
phones, we are on our electronic devices right in our hands, so we can get information so quickly, right? And so I think it's so important for organizations like the NAACP, who is a trusted messenger and community, to be in many different spaces and on many different platforms, whether that is podcasts, where we're seeing a larger growth of how folks are consuming their information and receiving their information, whether we are engaging in community and working with micro and macro influencers, right, and making sure those influencers have the right information and not spreading
Mhm.
mis and disinformation, but actually spreading the correct information and expanding their audiences. I think the other thing that progressives, Dems, civil rights orgs have to do is understand our audience, right? Though NAACP is a trusted messenger, it does not mean we're going to reach every single audience, right? And so we may be able to do the research, we may be very clear about what it is to say. However, we may have to give that messaging to someone else as a trusted messenger on their platform to carry what that looks like to expand our audiences.
Yes, and I guess like to your point, right, just as quickly as people can get good information on their phone, they can get bad
Mhm.
information. Are there leading outlets, resources, publications that you can point to now that you feel like are shaping the political conversation in the Black community? Because one of the things I feel, and correct me, of course, if it's not the case, but from creators I like to follow is it feels like the mainstream media wants to uplift folks like Charlemagne the God as the voice of Black people in politics, or certain other figures like the ESPN guy. I'm not a big sports person, so I'm blanking on his name.
Stephen A. Smith.
Yes, exactly, Stephen Smith. Is that reflective of what a large constituency wants to see? Who else is out there that folks are looking to?
I think one, it is reflective, right? I think
Okay.
because folks are, and what I mean by that, folks are receiving, are going to these platforms to get information. Now, and a good example, when I think about Stephen A. Smith, right? I don't know if folks are looking at his opinion to talk about what's politically happening. Right, I just don't think that's the case, and so we saw what happened with him and Jasmine Crockett a little
Yes.
earlier this year, right? And he backtracked around that. And I think he has took his foot off the gas a little bit around, inserting himself in things that he just don't know too much about, right? But there's an audience there that people follow him of Black people, particularly Black men,
Okay.
right? I think about the Breakfast Club, as you mentioned,
Yep.
Charlemagne the God. In recent years, we've continued to see political figures. Our very own president and CEO of the NAACP has been on the Breakfast Club a couple times, right? We've seen Vice President Kamala Harris in her role as VP and as
Okay.
also a candidate for president on the Breakfast Club, and so many others. I think Jasmine Crockett was on most recently. And
Yeah.
so there is an advantage to joining those platforms and reaching an audience who may not be receiving that type of information, political information, if you will, in a different way. So I will say there's an advantage, but it goes back to who is the messenger and then understanding that platform. For NAACP, I'm going to always say follow NAACP on all of our platforms to
Yes.
get information. But we repost and engage with Lady Vinay, who oftentimes posts information about mis and disinformation. So that's one of the things that we ask folks to follow, and we partner with her directly in several platforms. We've been
Mhm.
working with Joy Reid most recently, who
Okay.
was with MSNBC or MS these days, right? But she started her platform and it is growing. And she has a growing audience, and many of our folks follow that platform as well. So we're asking folks to go to places where, one, we're centering the stories of African Americans and Black folks, true stories of what
Yeah.
is happening, how does policy at the federal, state, and local level impact our lives. But then, two, making sure folks are having conversations with trusted individuals in the space. And the one thing I like to say, and I'll stop, Black voters, in my opinion, are the most, one of the smartest voting bloc in my opinion. The reason I say that because we're one of the most reliable voting blocks, and we show up and show out in most elections, right?
Yes.
And we're very clear about what it is that we want. And so black voters know the difference from a Stephen A. Smith and a Joanne Reed, right? And whether he's just blowing smoke and talking stuff, or a Joanne Reed who's actually providing clear and concise information around what's happening.
Okay, and I guess like media aside, then we need candidates that are
Hmm.
serving people and can win. And I feel like there's been an undercurrent or maybe an overcurrent at this point from some folks, both in the Democratic Party and outside of it, who feel like minority candidates, women candidates, can't win. We should stop putting them forward. And I personally think it's absolutely the wrong lesson to take away from 2024. But I'm curious what you're hearing on those things. And also, then obviously, do want to talk about Jasmine Crockett, who I love and who just launched her campaign for Senate in
Don't
Texas.
we love that? To your question, one, if you look at the current makeup of this country, it is very clear that we are moving more to a more minority majority country,
Mhm.
right? So black and brown folks across this country, minorities are continuing to shape what this country looks like. Which means representation should look like what the country should look like, right? In terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of age. You add all of those things up. I think, yes, there are rumblings, as always, post-election cycles. Do we go back and talk to working class? And working class is oftentimes code word to expanding the white working base. That is
Hmm.
code word for that. Prior to the NAACP, I worked in the labor movement, so I'm very clear about what working class means. Now, there are working class people of color, black and brown folks, but when you hear that talk, it is very
Right.
clear that folks are trying to move away from the growing audience around black and brown or minority voters and candidates. As it relates to candidates, it's clear and there's evidence in the pudding when you see um, people of color, black folks, brown folks, women at the top of the ticket, turnout is higher, right? People are more engaged around that. And so if I'm a Democratic Party, right, if I'm making decisions and thinking about candidates in the near future, I would be thinking about candidates that are black and brown, that are women, that are young, right? We look what this past election cycle along, right? We saw what happened in New York, right? We clearly
Mhm.
saw what happened in New Jersey and Virginia. We saw what happened in mayoral races across the country, right? There were black women mayors elected across the country. There were black mayors elected in cities, reelected, reappointed in cities. Turnout was high at the top of the ticket and at the bottom of the ticket as well. And so it is in the best opinion, I think, of progressives and the Democratic Party to continue to want to push forth candidates of color, women candidates in particular, and younger candidates because there is a shift that's happening in this country and the status quo is just not working anymore.
Absolutely. And I think, so Jasmine Crockett launched her race, and in my opinion, her pitch is that she's going to be able to reach new kinds of voters. For folks that don't know, in 2022, Texas had 10 million registered
Yep.
voters stay home. So there's a lot of opportunity to excite folks and mobilize them and turn them out, as opposed to the strategy, which is often the case in these swing states that Democrats try, which is to just win at that margin with swing voters and go for moderates and go for independents. And online, there's been such strong backlash to Crockett jumping in to try this. And I find it interesting because I think to me, obviously, this is not a one-for-one comparison, but when we see folks like a Graham Plattner or even a Mamdani, right? Male candidates, white candidates who say, I want to talk to a new type of voter, who are very digitally savvy, who take MAGA head on, speak truth to power, all those things, the mainstream media tends to say this is the future of the Democratic Party. And a lot of folks on the left get really excited about candidates like that. And somehow, when it's Jasmine Crockett, they're writing about how her acrylic nails and her eyelashes, and they don't like that her phone screen was herself. What do you make of that? Is it just sort of individually based and person to person, or is there something more happening?
It's something more happening. It's a cultural thing when we come to Democratic politics. It has always, or just politics in general, it has always been that there is the male savior oftentimes the white male savior on either side, but particularly for Democrats. I
Mhm.
think Jasmine may have said it, Congresswoman Crockett, actually, she may have said it, right, in an interview that she did yesterday. I feel like I saw immediately after her launch, is that she poses a threat because she challenges the status quo. So of course they're going to critique everything about her that has nothing to do with the job that she is doing, that she do
Right.
quite well. I might add, right? I think she is, the NAACP is nonpartisan when they sit it on the record, but I definitely think she is well poised to be the Senate candidate, and ideally and hopefully maybe the nominee for the Democratic Party for the Senate for Senate there in Texas. And there's a strong note to the piece that you mentioned around the 10 million voters there, registered voters there. Texas,
Hmm.
Texas has the largest population of Black folks in the country, right? And so there's a lot of mobilization work. So if you think about a candidate at the top of the ticket in a year like 2026, like Jasmine Crockett, not only she's going to speak truth to power, not only
Hmm.
does she have the experience, both from the litigation side as a civil rights attorney, but also being in Congress from a policy side of things. She represents a state with so many people that look like her, right? And there's clearly a lot of brown folks in Texas as well to be able to mobilize that. She understands what is happening. She is the changing demographic that I was just speaking of when we think about minorities moving forward in this country and growing and continuing to grow. And so I think Jasmine is poised. I think we need to see more candidates continue to come out bold and strong like her.
I love that answer. And I guess I wonder how, and feel free to speak just for yourself, but how folks at the NAACP and doing the work you do reacted to Michelle Obama sort of coming out and saying that, basically a black woman is not going to get elected in this country and doesn't get treated, obviously, as we saw, Kamala Harris was treated very badly, I think, at least. What did you make of those statements and how did you sort of view them?
The facts are the facts, right? Around that, when we see black women continue to climb and run for some of the highest offices or ran for the highest office
Hmm.
of the land, I will say one, it is a thing when we think about folks being misogynist, right? In a way, so there's that against women in general. But then when it comes to black women, it's just two, three times as harder. I think about the comments that former First Lady Michelle Obama made. I think she was referencing that we as a country is not ready for a woman president. And I think what she was referencing and what we made of that is time and time again, you all prove, regardless of how qualified a Hillary Clinton is, regardless of how qualified a Stacey Abrams is, regardless of how qualified Kamala Harris is, right? And the list can go on, regardless of how qualified these women are. You all continue to turn your back on that, right? And I
Hmm.
think data can show, and I wish the first lady had some data because what she was saying is right, but data shows that, and that's the reality. That's what we took from that in a big way.
Okay. And then I guess given that, it seems like we're agreeing the solution is to run those candidates until
Yeah,
we change that. I think her take was maybe not to do, that she's at least she was speaking for herself, I think, to clarify that she's not going to be running for any of those things because of that set
yeah.
of factors. I guess like the other question I have, and I see online a lot and it must come up a lot in your work, is this idea, and I've seen it in response to Jasmine Crockett's launch of misogynoir, and I guess that maybe male black voters and female black voters are split on certain ideas and issues. Is that something that is coming up a lot? Is it something you tailor your messaging and work around, or is that really a very online sort of conversation?
I think it depends on where you're hearing it from and what's coming from
Okay.
online, if it's research based or not. What I like to always say, Black voters are not a monolith. We're just
Yeah.
like any other group, right? There's going to be difference of opinions at times. I think the what is true among Black voters,
Mhm.
90+% of the time, Black voters do, both men and women, land on a progressive candidate.
Okay.
right? So clearly there is alignment on values of a candidate and policies in a way. Clearly there's huge alignment around that. I think there is a lot of disinformation and misinformation
Hmm.
online. I do think there's a lot that the right tends to do, particularly when it pertains to Black men,
Yeah.
and try to split Black men within Black men, and also try to split Black men from Black women. But I always say that's why organizations like the NAACP is so important. Our research and how we're engaging voters is so important because we understand our community much better than people who don't understand our community. And so being able to do that and continue to be a trusted messenger oftentimes can block much of that noise. It goes back to narrative control that we talked about
Hmm.
earlier around platforms and looking at media and where folks are getting and consuming information. The more good information and accurate and back data research information that we can put out, the easier it is to debunk much of the disinformation and some of the misinformation that happens online as it relates to Black men and women voters.
Thank you so much. And I guess my last question for you, and I'm going to put you on the spot. What's something that makes you hopeful in a moment like this?
Ooh, I think what makes me hopeful in a moment like this, when I think about election day this year, this past Tuesday, 2025, a recent election, not 24, to see the excitement of folks in these elections that we haven't seen before on an off year election or an
Yep.
odd year election, it made me hopeful that people are still paying attention and haven't checked out. Right. I think what makes me hopeful as well is when we see candidates like Jasmine Crockett announce, or a Mandela Barnes in
Hmm.
Wisconsin who recently re-announced for governor, and so many other candidates. You're seeing these young and candidates of color just jump out. And I think that makes me hopeful. Last night in Miami,
Yep.
the mayoral race was flipped, right, from Republican to Democrat. That makes me hopeful that people are paying attention, right, and folks are not giving up and fighting back.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all the work you're doing and for joining us today, Dominic.